Welcome back. On this Mandela Day, United Nations Secretary-General António Guterres has observed the world today is marred by war, overwhelmed by emergencies, blighted by racism, discrimination, poverty and inequality, and threatened by a climate disaster. This is South Africa, Mandela's land of birth, is lurching from one crisis to another as well. We've been battling unrelenting power cuts and an economy that seems to be constantly on a downward spiral, along, of course, recently with an apparent spike in mass murders at taverns. So what do we have to do then on this Mandela Day to take South Africa in the direction that everyone wants to see it in, or in fact create a mindset to inspire a more future forward-looking country? Let's speak to Stellenbosch Business School Strategic Foresight Advisor, Dr Morne Mostert. Good to have you on the program, Doctor. So this year's Mandela Day, and I don't know if you share this observation, appears a bit more muted, not as much going on, even in terms of what people are sharing online, because in previous years that's where you'd see a lot of the traffic. Do you think it has to do with where we are as a country?
Good afternoon. I certainly think it does. I think there's a little bit of what we sometimes call change fatigue. There was for a long time the theory that if we can just demonstrate a little bit of an act of kindness, then perhaps the entire system over time would change. I think what we're learning now is we're needing something much more profound, much deeper, much more significant to give us the kind of future that we're hoping for. While these small events, of course, are inspirational and they do touch the hearts, I think it's perhaps useful to say, Tabakila, that when we study the leadership of President Mandela, yes, there is that amazingly big heart, that empathy, that care and concern. But Mr. Mandela also demonstrated an amazing intellectual ability, which I think we may have a lot to learn from.
So just on where South Africans are at the moment, you've got people who lost work at the beginning of the pandemic, have not found work since. You've got people who've lost work in recent months because of fallout from global events, including the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, right? The global economy is not doing as well as it should. How do you inspire people who themselves need so much help at the moment, need a bit of good news, to go out there and participate in an act of kindness for someone else?
It's a tremendously important question given where we are. But just consider for a moment that you are a citizen of the Ukraine at the moment and look at what President Zelensky is doing as just one example. So here's a prime example of a leader under enormous threat, pressure and crisis who somehow finds the strength of character to connect with citizens. That, of course, is something that we had in Mr. Mandela. It is something that we now need beyond these small, however important, acts of kindness to have a much more fundamental shift to an alternative future for the country.
How do we get to that point?
To my mind, there are a few ways of doing it. We can talk about the mechanisms here, but what I'm particularly interested in is the mindset of leaders. There's been a huge amount of research in this area over the last 10 years or so. Much of it has focused on a kind of optimism and self-belief. I think even that is now in need of innovation itself. And so I think we can think of mindsets really in two ways. The one is that the mind in a way has set. You know, it's kind of outdated. I think when you listen to these activists you just spoke to a few moments ago, you can hear from young people that there's a deep sense that for many leaders, their minds essentially have not kept up with the 21st century. So that's the first dimension of mindset that's important to me if we want the kind of change we want to see. Moving beyond a mind that has set to a mind that is fluid, is agile, and very importantly, is creative to solve the kind of complex problems that we face today. The second idea around mindset that I want to share is the idea that ideas in your mind, where else would they be, operate in sets. In other words, when you think of one thing, you automatically think of another. And that really is the kind of spirit of Mr. Mandela that I think we're trying to inspire. So for me, mindset of leaders is the number one way in which we can think about an alternative future. And the way to judge that is to judge the behavior of leaders. There are a few ways in which we can change thinking, of course.
I want to talk to you more then about the issue of leadership, because Nelson Mandela was part of a political leadership. At the time, the struggle was being led by political movements, the ANC, the PAC, and others. When you look at where we are now, approaching 30 years into this country's democracy, it appears very much as though the next level of, shall we say, top-tier leadership is not necessarily going to be political? Do you think that time has come and gone where the politicians led society?
I think many young people are certainly feeling a sense of disconnection, and why wouldn't they? If you just look at the demographics, we have in excess of 28% of the population, it's close to a third, under the age of 15. Only about 9% of the population is over 60. So if you look at the cabinet composition, just as one example, in many other leaders in many other spheres of society, you can see that risk of a disconnect of the generations. We have youth unemployment by some estimates in excess of 65%. So I think the youth is a critical dimension here, and something that we ignore at our peril. Now, how do we engage that? Well, as I've illustrated before, I think the one dimension is mindset. If you want to understand mindset, just look at people's behavior, and you will immediately understand their mindset. When it comes to that Mandela example, what we often say is that you can think of new thinking. So if we say in South Africa what we need is new thinking, then we'd say you can do that in three ways: the content, the level, and the method. So you can think of other things, new things, not the same old rehashed ideas, same old ideological solutions that we've had for decades. That's the one thing. The second is the level, and what Mr. Mandela demonstrated here is a strategic level, number one, and number two, a longer-term orientation. There's the strategic foresight. And then thirdly, the method. How do leaders think about solving problems? Do they try to simply reinforce outdated methods through what we would call an analytical approach, which is characterized by segmenting things like humans into little blocks of races, for example? Or do they think, as Mr. Mandela did, more systemically, that is, holistically? So important, for example, for social cohesion where we are in the country at the moment. So we need leaders with alternative ways to think and solve problems.
And your title, of course, is that of Strategic Foresight Advisor. And I want to talk about foresight and its role in mapping South Africa's route out of the multiple crises that we're facing, be it economic, be it on the energy front, be it crime.
Yeah, that's right. So in the 20th century, leaders sort of got away with a lack of strategic foresight. One of the reasons why it is now a very well-studied academic discipline all around the world. You could sort of make very strong bets on very long horizons. Where we are now, of course, is a hyper-complex environment, and we need leaders with a 21st century mindset. That includes the ability to think strategically and to think with foresight. So if you ask young people at the moment, what do they interpret as the longer-term vision for the country? Of course, the National Development Plan was aimed at answering that question. There is a new NPC in place. You know, of course, I'm a member of the National Planning Commission. And so I think a new spirit of longer-term orientation for the country is required. That would get us away from short-term fixes essentially driven by political decision-making. So I do think young people have the longest horizon of all of us. They're going to be here for the longest. When they look around at the climate, at social cohesion, at what we're doing with energy, at what the economic prospects are, I think they're in desperate need of someone to paint a picture of an attractive, alternative future. This may go some way to produce the hope you were speaking of.
All right, thank you very much for that. Dr. Morne Mostert speaking to us on this Nelson Mandela Day. Thank you for your time, sir.